Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Fisher with the Education Department at Michigan Bankers Association. Thanks for joining us today. A few quick housekeeping items. Please be sure to mute yourself unless you are asking a question, and we will save verbal questions for the end. But you are welcome to use the chat feature and the reactions throughout the webinar today. You'll find both of those located in your toolbar. And I will be moderating the chat to make sure that our presenter receives your questions. We are also recording today, and a link will be shared along with the handouts. Before I introduce our presenter, Leslie Fiorenzo, I want to ask you 3 questions. Do you feel overwhelmed and struggle trying to accomplish everything on your to-do list? Do you feel like you need to be available 24/7 to respond to all requests from employees, clients, family, and colleagues? Do you shift from project to project without finishing one before starting the other? So if you answered yes to any of these questions, you are in the right spot. Our program today will give you the framework to help you manage your day-to-day tasks and serve as a guide to help you reach your goals. Our presenter is a former EAP and HR professional turned performance coach. She is the founder of Coach with Leslie and the author of 21 Lessons for Mastering Difficult Conversations. Leslie Fiorenzo is a frequent speaker for MBA. She speaks at our Perry School of Banking, our Emerging Leaders events, among others. Leslie enjoys daily walks with her daughter and her 3 granddogs. Please help me welcome Leslie Fiorenzo.
Thanks, Stephanie. So if I would have told you 20 years ago, even maybe a little bit longer, that I would have been doing something on time management, I probably would have laughed at you. As a matter of fact, I rode together early in my career with a work carpooled with someone, and she said to me, "If you make me late one more time, I'm not picking you up anymore." So suffice to say, I've come a long way, and I want to share just a few ideas with you today in the time we have together. And I really want to answer your questions because I would guess you have some. At least I hope you do. So as Stephanie said, please put them in the chat at any time, but we'll probably save them to the end and for me to address them. So I hope that you had an opportunity to download and print out the handout that I had as a note-taking device. You should have received 2. One is kind of a workbook for the program, and the other one is a resource page. And there's some resources that I'm going to mention throughout, so you don't have to miss them. There's links there and other kinds of things. So I want to share 4 ideas in our time together today. I want to talk about some new habits that you might want to adopt. Maybe some habits you want to change. We're going to talk about habits. Then we're going to talk about planning. So I want to get you thinking about, how do I create a plan when I don't really know what that next day is going to look like? I mean, the environment we're living in right now is so fluid, right, and so changing. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about some templates, things that I have used that I found to be successful. And then lastly, we're going to wrap it up and talk about systems, and then we'll take questions, as I said. So what does this number represent? Anybody put, what do you think that is? If you can put it in the chat box, and then Stephanie, when you get a couple of ideas, if you can share with me.
Emails per year?
Oh, emails per year. That's a really good guess. No, actually, it is the number of seconds in a day. And I'm going to guess somebody knew that. They just didn't want to respond. But here's what I want you to think about. Imagine that there's a bank that credits your account each morning with $86,400. Carries no balance from day to day. Every evening, the bank deletes whatever part of that balance is you failed to use during that day. What would you do? Well, probably withdraw every cent, right? So each of us has such a bank, and that bank is time. Every morning, it credits you with 86,400 seconds. At the end of every night, it writes us off as lost. Whatever of this you have failed to invest for good purpose, it's gone, never going to get it back again. It carries no balance, and it allows no overdraft. Each day it opens a new account for you, and each night it burns the remains of the day. If you fail to use the day's deposits, the loss is yours. There is no going back. There is no drawing against the tomorrow. We have to live in the present of each day's deposits. So invest it as you get it to the utmost in your health, your happiness, and your success. The clock is running. Make the most of each day. So to realize the value of 1 year, ask a student who fails to graduate. To realize the value of a month, ask a mother who just gave birth to a premature infant. To ask the value of 1 week, ask the editor of a weekly newspaper. To realize the value of an hour, ask lovers who are waiting to meet. To realize the value of a minute, ask the person who just missed the train. And to realize the value of a second, ask the person who just avoided an accident. Treasure every moment that you have and reassure it more because you shared it with someone special enough to spend your time with. Remember that time waits for no one. Yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, and today is a gift. That's why they call it the present. And as Zig Ziglar would remind us, it's not time, it's the lack of direction. He says, lack of direction, not time, is the problem. We all have 24 hours in the day. So if you only leave here with one idea today, that is, every day is a gift. And it's up to you how to maximize it. We can't manage time. We can only manage ourselves against time. And as Mark Twain would remind us when we talk about habits, it's so easy to look around and see, oh, everybody else has the problem. He says nothing needs reforming as other people's habits. I want to encourage you to think about your habits. And I believe most of the time it's 1 or 2 tweaks that we can make that will make a huge difference. So one of the things that I have come to believe is really important is the idea of winning the morning to win the day. In his book, author Tim Ferriss, he authored a book called The 4-Hour Work Week. And this is a quote from him: win the morning, win the day. He says, first thing you do is make your bed. Now, I don't do that, and there's a really good reason why. Because my husband's still in it when I get up in the morning. He's retired, and so I get up way before he does. So I'm not going to make my bed. But I am going to come downstairs, and I have a yoga routine. I have inspirational reading that I do. From that inspirational reading, I create a post for social media. I usually journal, and I usually read another book for inspiration, meditation, and find that time in the morning is really precious to me. And as a matter of fact, I recently, with the event of us all being sequestered at home, or many of us are now at home, working at home, my daughter and I, prior to March 23rd, had a morning routine that included a walk at 5 a.m. And she lives about 0.3 of a mile from me. So I would meet her, and we'd take her dog, the three dogs. And we've changed that now till noon, since neither one of us has the commute we did have. And she's also working remotely, working from home. So that's been one adjustment in our morning routine. But otherwise, for me, it's been the same. And another quote from Zig Ziglar, he says, people say motivation doesn't last. Well, neither does bathing. That's why we recommend it daily. So I'm going to recommend, if you fly out of bed and just get down to the computer, and the challenge sometimes for many of us working remotely is we don't have that commute. We no longer have that structure. But I want to encourage you to think about, how can I put that structure and how can I bring value to my morning? Aristotle, Will Durant, several people have been given credit for this quote, but it's we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence is not an act, but a habit. So let's think about 3 habits that we might want to implement. Self-care is not selfish. And so what is self-care to you? Well, self-care doesn't always mean being easy and doing easy, right? Some people think, oh, self-care is, sleeping in and being relaxed, and maybe, but I think self-care is the discipline of good focused habits that are beneficial. So that morning routine, nutritious, eating, drinking lots of water, exercising, all of those good things are self-care habits that are really important. And then when we think about habits as it relates to our people, I think especially if in fact you are working remotely, and I'm going to guess there are some of you who are and some of you who are not, but finding ways to connect with your team and learning the tools, right? Learning Zoom and GoToWebinar and all of the other kinds of remote work tools. A lot of companies I see from advertisements on television are using Teams. That may or may not be true for you, but find ways to communicate and check in with your team on a very regular basis. Sometimes it can be easy, it's out of sight, out of mind. So the other thing to think about when you're checking in with your people is making it personal and focusing on what's going well. What I've noticed lately about team meetings is it can be really easy to get off track and complain. Now, when we're in person, we often complain, but I've also noticed that people, as they come to virtual calls, we can, without an agenda, without specifics, easily go down that rabbit trail of complaining. And then I want to encourage you to establish expectations with people about availability and response time. We've, for the last several years, lived in a world of 24/7, right? Email and Facebook Messenger and texting and all of those tools were available before mid-March, but they now are being used more and more, and especially tools like Zoom and Microsoft Teams and some of those virtual applications. So there's an expectation that is false. I think we can't be available 24/7, and this necessary or need for immediate response, I think, is again false and sets us up for failure. So be really clear with your teams, with your family. So it's right now, one of the new habits I had to establish in a home office with a husband who's retired, and we share this space, so his computer is across the room from mine, but he knows that when that door behind me is shut, that I am not to be disturbed, that I'm on the phone, on a webinar, on a something where I can't be disturbed. So we've had talks about that. And then we're going to talk about task management, and sometimes that's new habits in terms of time blocking. We'll talk about time blocking. You may prefer the word jam session. I've heard people use that too, but it's time set aside for focused work. And I'm going to recommend 60 to 90 minutes, but I've also heard recently that if I just can knock out something in 20 minutes, I'm better served. And then set up yourself for success. So what's my day look like? What's my plan look like? And if I can, especially as it relates to email, use autoresponders. So I have a friend who is a coach in the New York City area, and his autoresponder, because it's just Gene in his business, he doesn't have a virtual assistant or anything like that, but if you email him, you'll get an autoresponder that says something to the effect of, thanks for your email, and I make it an attempt to, or my intention is to respond to you within 24 hours. If, however, it becomes 72 or 42 or 48 or 72 hours, and I haven't responded, then email me again because I've lost track of your email. So I believe we should make tools available that set us up for success. So those are just a couple of them. The other thing I want to encourage you to think about is thinking and what you say when you talk to yourself. And by the way, that's the name of a great book if you've never read it. But really begin to think about planting thoughts for success. And in your handout, there is, I believe, a little poem about this. But there's a lot of people who have been attributed to this statement. Emerson, Buddha, Frank Outlaw, Margaret Thatcher. But new studies in neuroscience show that we can change the negativity bias of our brain by focusing on the positive. People often wonder why we seem to remember negative experiences more, noticing how negative thoughts can spiral us down into a deep, dark hole. Well, some answers on this and how to shift our brain to a more positive outlook can be found in Rick Hanson's book, Buddha's Brain, The Practical Neuroscience of Happiness, Love, and Wisdom. And Dr. Hanson is a neuropsychologist who's practiced Buddhist mindful meditation for many years. So, drawing on his own personal experience and professional knowledge and research, he shows us how we can shape and change our brain to affect and enhance our well-being, reduce suffering, and develop inner peace. Now, I know we're talking about time mastery today, but really mastering self, and that's what his book is about, is the key to do that. So by studying brainwaves of those who maintain a contemplative or meditative practice, scientists have learned a great deal about brain states and underlying wholesome mental states and how to really activate those states. Research has been able to show us that our mind can change our brain and vice versa, and in some instances, even change our genes. Hanson explains the evolution of our brain and how the brain attachment to the negative helped ensure our survival. But the good news is the converse is also true. We can create positive pathways and change our brain by focusing on the good. So as you begin your virtual team meetings, one of the things I would encourage you to ask people is what's going well, what's going great, what's a win that you've had. You know, sometimes we come together to problem solve, rightly so, and we're focusing on the problem or the issue or the negative, but start by focusing on what's good, what's going right. Remember our brain's natural affinity for the negative? Well, we tend to register our more pleasurable experiences quite the same. So we tend not to register our pleasurable experiences not quite the same. So we have to cultivate them. So we need to focus and savor the feelings that come from these positive experiences. So like that cup of coffee in the morning or cup of tea, whatever your preference, or the smell of flowers on the gentle breeze. I notice that now that we're getting spring and you can smell some blossoms. Maybe it's a greeting from an old friend, or maybe you had a great experience with someone recently. Maybe even though it was virtual, prolonging your attention on these good experiences and taking in the sensory experience of joy or pleasure can create new neural pathways that strengthen our capacity towards self-regulation, which is a peaceful body, compassion, a peaceful heart, and wisdom, a peaceful mind. How we feel is not just as important for our mental well-being, but it's also for our physical well-being. Our mind moves information through our nervous system, just like our heart moves blood around our body, and our brain is the mover and shaper of our mind. This is, I'm quoting from Hanson's book. The brain and the mind interact as one unified system and intertwine with our immune, cardiovascular, and endocrine systems. There's an old saying that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. It's our response to pain that determines our suffering. So if you are in a space right now where you're feeling pretty blue and pretty dismal about all that's happening, I want to encourage you to maybe search a resource. So as Stephanie told you, my background's EAP. I've always got to put a plug in for your employee assistance program. If you have one, pick up the phone. It's free, it's confidential. It can help you. That counselor on the other end of that line can help you get out of that dark space. But no human being can get through life without experiencing some physical or mental discomfort but we don't have to attach the suffering to it. It's a result. Our suffering is a result of our reaction. So we can. I'm not suggesting that it's easy, but I'm suggesting that it's possible. And one of the things I want to really encourage you to think about is, what are you thinking about? What are you focusing on? So let's talk about planning. And I believe now more than ever, plans have to be flexible. We have to give ourselves and others some grace, if you will. And what we also know is that during times of crisis like this, Gallup has and others have studied companies who've come out way ahead. They are definitely the organizations who planned, but it's only really 9% of the companies who thrived during changing times. And one of the components of that is planning. Another important component of that is investment in the leadership development of their people. So pat on your back, pat on the back to all of you today to taking some time to invest in yourself and creating that opportunity. So a couple of gurus that I've listened to lately when it comes to planning have talked about think short term. I mean, we often plan in lengths of time, and many companies have 3, 5, 10-year goals. Nothing wrong with that, but what recent people have suggested is that we need to take a look at maybe the next 3 months in terms of planning and really focusing there and not the year-long plans. So my question to you is, what will you do today that you will be happy about 90 days from now? Another way to frame this is, do something today that your future self is going to thank you for. So one of the things that I'm going to do today is get my protein shake ready for the morning. So I blend it up, I put it in the fridge, and it's there. And even though I no longer have a commute, and that was really helpful when I did, I know it's ready, and it's one less thing I have to do in the morning. So let's talk about charting new territory, because again, we know change is rapid. We know the future is uncertain. And Mark Cuban is one of those guys I was talking about earlier. And you might know Mark from Shark Tank. He's a serial entrepreneur and he owns an MBA team. And he was recently asked what he's seeing are the keys to maneuvering in this storm. And he says there's two: agility and resilience. So being able to switch or turn on a dime, as they say, but really practicing that idea of self-care, resiliency, looking forward, thinking about how can I maximize the opportunity that might be before me. And I also heard Simon Sinek on a program the other day, and you might know Simon. He's written a couple books and he's got a lot of information out on YouTube. But he said, we have to stop thinking or saying we're going to return when we get back to normal. And I know I use new normal in the title, and that's really a phrase I dislike, but because I think change happens every day, and what is normal after all. But thinking about it, what one of the comments Simon made was, it's not ever going to be the same. And to long for or think about returning to some past, it's not going to happen. We have to say, what's done is done. How can I maximize? How can I move forward? And it's also important to acknowledge we've not been through this before, although he says we have. He said we've faced, as humans, monumental change. Think about, one of the examples he gave is, think about how the advent of the internet put many companies out of business. Companies that weren't able to be flexible, companies that weren't able to be agile. And we know, all we have to do is look at Amazon, right? The impact of online purchasing. So he says, acknowledge fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. It is uncharted territory, so to speak. Yet we know as humans, we have the capacity to change and grow. And so finding ways to grow through this. I would also encourage you to limit your exposure to news and social media. And I know for many of you, news is important and we need to be aware, especially in your industry. You've got to stay up to date with what's happening, but limit that and don't have a steady diet of it. As I've visited businesses in the past, and maybe you've seen in other companies' lobbies, CNN is on in that receptionist waiting area all the time. And I've always felt bad for that receptionist who had to be having a steady diet of all that news all day long. Not good. So I want to get you to think, as James Dean reminds us, dream as if you'll live forever, but live as if you'll die today. So when we think about plans, now what I'm going to tell you in the next minute, you're going to say, well, you just told me something different, and this is more personal as opposed to business, but I want you to imagine a date in the future. Now that might be the day you retire from work, it might be your 80th birthday, it might be your 50th wedding anniversary, it might be your 50th whatever. But imagine there's a celebration. And I want you to see the people that are going to be there, and what are they going to be saying about you? What do you want those people to be saying about you? And I would encourage you to write out the answer. So you might have to come back at the end of our time together today and really give that some thought. But then the question is, am I living today so I can make that happen? You know, if I say, oh, I want to write a book someday, which was a few years ago true for me. I knew I had to make a plan to make it become a reality, or it would just be a wish. It wouldn't be a goal. It would never happen. So in your, let's see, I clicked on the wrong thing. In your handout, there's a wheel of life. And again, this is a homework assignment. I'm not going to be able to take time in our webinar today, but I want to encourage you to think about this. So this really corresponds to the question I just asked you. And those are areas. You might not have all of those areas that apply to you, but generally speaking, people have time they spend in each one of their areas. They have some kind of faith practice, some kind of financial goals. They want to work on their health. They volunteer in some capacity. They have family. They have friends. They want to pursue some continuing education of some sort. And then there's work. And for most of us, work takes up a big chunk of that wheel of our life. And I don't want to suggest to you that this wheel or that they're going to be divided in equal portion, because I don't think that's possible. But I want you to think about time spent in each one of those. How important is that time spent? And if I'm not where I want to be, what am I going to do to make some adjustments or some changes so that as I look at my wheel, I feel like it's in harmony? People talk often about work-life balance. I don't know that work-life balance is possible, because when I think of balance, I think about scales, right? You think about even distribution. I think it's work-life harmony. I think it's about doing things that are important to you. And work is a given for all of us, I'm going to guess. I don't know if there's anyone that's on the call. If there is, put it in the chat bar. I'm always curious to know this. If someone does this just because it's their philanthropy, it's the way they give back and they're not getting paid and they don't care about getting paid. I think most of us work so we can do other things. We can do the family, the friends, the vacations, the health, all those kinds of things. So Tony Robbins puts it this way: how am I going to live today to create the tomorrow I've committed to? So I would encourage you to take some time this evening, before you go to bed, maybe give up a little bit of gaming or television or whatever it is you do in the evening, to spend some time thinking about these questions. Because after all, I believe, as Gary Keeler says, work is a rubber ball. If you drop it, it'll bounce back. But the other four, the family, the health, the friends, the integrity, are made of glass. And if you drop one of these, it will be irrevocably scuffed, nicked, or perhaps even shattered. So I would encourage you to do that thinking and writing. So let's talk about priorities. Now, in the handout, in the resource page, I gave you a link to this article from a blog post about Warren Buffett, and it's the website is liveyourlegend.net. But Buffett's process for identifying priorities is to write out your top 25 and then eliminate 20 of them. So what are you going to focus on in the next few months or maybe even year to get those 5 priorities to be reality? So is it time with your team? Is it a promotion? Is it time with customers? Is it more sales? Is it whatever your goals are, that go along with your priorities? So you can take a look at that article should you choose to do that. So let's talk a little bit about a template and what you can do to create a template for your plan and for your life. And one of my favorite templates, and there's more, but this is one that I really, really like. And so I want to spend some time here for a few minutes and invite you to put in a couple answers in the chat bar, and then Stephanie can report out on them. But let me give you a little bit of information. If you've not seen this quadrant before, this is Covey's 2x2 matrix, classifying tasks as urgent and non-urgent, and important and not important. Important items are identified by focusing on a few key priorities and roles, which it's going to vary from person to person, and identifying small goals for each role each week in order to maintain a holistic life balance. I'm going to say holistic life harmony. One tool for this is a worksheet that lists up to 7 key roles and 3 weekly goals per role. So you can find that in the 7 Habits book if that's a template you like to use. There are many others. One that I've recently adopted is from Darren Hardy, and it's his journal. It's called Best Year Yet. And again, it's a planning system. Now he limits his to 3 a week as opposed to 7 key roles. But the concept is illustrated by encouraging you to think about putting those big rocks in first. And you've probably read this story about the professor that came in to the class and had a jar full of rocks, and he asked his students if it was full, and some said yes or some said no, or someone looked at him like, I'm not sure what your point is. And then he dumped in some gravel, and is that full? And well, some said yes, some said no. And then he dumped in some sand, and then he dumped in some water, or in some stories it says a beer, and there's some joke about there's always room for a beer, which, maybe there is. But anyway, the idea behind this is if I've got to put that big stuff in my schedule first, or there's not going to be any room. Because if I put all the small stuff in, if you put the sand, the water and the sand and the gravel, and then try to force those big rocks in, there would not be any room. Now, Covey also tells us we're also all going to have quadrant 1 activities. We're all going to have crises. We're all going to have pressing problems. We're all going to have project deadlines. But what we want to focus on is quadrant 2, the relationship building, the planning, the recreation. Now, Brian Tracy tells us that for every 10 minutes we spend in planning, we spend 10 hours in execution. So I have learned over the years the importance of planning. As I said, when I first started out, that was not something I was akin to or did much. But what happens to us is quadrant 3 and 4 activities show up like they might be quadrant 1 and 2. And so we have to be really careful. So think for just a minute and put in the chat bar, what are some things that represent for you quadrant 3 and 4 activities? And I was just like, if we were live together, you'd be hollering out your responses, but you're not going to be able to do that. So I'm going to rely on Stephanie to read them.
Text messages.
Text messages, yes. that the only one?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I was waiting. I thought you were looking. Okay. So let's just talk about tech, because I think that to some degree goes along with email. The beautiful thing about your smart device is it has many unique features, but there is something called Do Not Disturb that I would encourage you to use. And again, you've got to set up expectations for people. So when is my expectation about responding to text? And it might be a text on your smartphone. It might be a message through your computer system. You know, there's many companies that have, and the word for that totally has gone out of my brain. But, you know, ways to communicate, instant messenger is what I was looking for. Be real clear about expectations about when I'm going to respond. And in just a minute, I'm going to talk about time blocking, but I would encourage you to think about certain times to do certain things. So if I set up 60 to 90-minute work sessions in my day, and maybe I have one in the morning and one in the afternoon, then I've got other times where I'm free to respond to text messages. I'm free to respond to emails. To me, a text message is a lot like somebody coming to your office, knocking on your door and saying, do you have a minute, right? That's what we used to do. And so it's always a choice to me. When I first started, I was probably in my career about 10 years. And I had a boss. I was new to this job. And so I was new to the company, new to the job, and had a lot of questions. So about every hour or two, I'd walk to his office and knock on his door and say, hey, you got a minute? And at the end of the first week, he said, you know, we're going to do something a little different. I said, what's that? He said, you're going to keep a running list of your questions, and we're going to get together at the end of the day and review them, and I'm going to answer them. Now, if it's truly an emergency, and he defined emergency, and really an emergency was somebody was bleeding. I was in a manufacturing plant, or, you know, a loss of life was threatened. Otherwise, it wasn't an emergency. And so we reviewed them. So it was a huge time saver for both of us. So I would encourage you to treat text messages. I would also encourage you to turn off the notifications on your smartphone, with maybe a couple of exceptions. So I have 3 notifications that come on my smartphone, and my phone right now is on Do Not Disturb. So I'll pick it up afterwards. But my email, phone calls, and text messages. But Facebook, LinkedIn, any apps, any games, all of those notifications are turned off. So Stephanie, let me see, is there anything else that came up in the chat bar while I was talking?
Being easily sidetracked and social media.
Yeah, social media. So again, I use social media as a tool, and I would encourage you to think of it that way. I would also, I think there's a ton, my opinion, you can disagree with me, there's a ton of negativity on social media. And so there's a few people that I've begun to unfollow simply because of that, because every post is a complaint or every post is negative. And I just don't want that in my space. And so I don't get myself involved in that. I don't have instant messenger notifications on my phone. And I know there are some business applications for Facebook, and some people use it in that way, LinkedIn as well. But I'm pretty particular about that. And so it's just not getting sucked into that temptation of having to respond or engaging in that conversation. I know there are so many ways to communicate. I mean, it used to be like a couple, right? We could face-to-face in person, and then write a letter, and then the phone, well, probably before phone, telegraph, but whatever. Most of us, it was phone. And then the explosion of the internet. So, I mean, I'm sure there's some of you that remember it was pretty cool when you got a fax, and fax is passe nowadays. So good. Stephanie, anything else before I move on? Okay. So I just want to encourage you to think about, how can I plan so that most of my day is filled with quadrant 2 activities, and quadrant 1 is going to creep in, and how can I eliminate, to the best of my ability, activities that occur in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. I keep clicking on the wrong thing. Now, so I want to talk about, so time blocking, and in your resource guide, there's the link to the YouTube video from Elon Musk. It takes about 25 minutes to get myself back on track when I'm working on a project once I've been interrupted. So I am a big believer in blocking out times for project work. I'm also a big believer in using people to help me with this. So one of two ways. If I have a colleague I can rely on we can trade back and forth if we have to be available, and we've got to be monitoring email or text messages or that kind of thing during business hours, trade off. So it doesn't always fall on you, so that you can have some uninterrupted time. So to the best of your ability, create some time to work on projects. Now, years ago, and I was guilty of this, I know I, as an HR professional, ran an ad that wanted multitaskers, but we can't. We literally cannot. Our brains cannot hold don't have the ability to do more than one cognitive thing at a time. So according to research done by Mayer, Evans, and Rubenstein, there's converging evidence that human executive control processes have two distinct but complementary stages. One stage they call goal shifting. So I want to do this now instead of that. And the other stage they call rule activation. I'm turning off the rules for that. I'm turning off the rules for this. They say both of these stages help people without much awareness switch between tasks. So really, we're good at switching between two, but we can't do two things at once. Hence, driving and texting, right? We can't do something I've got to think about. I can drive and listen to music. I can drive and have a conversation, but I'm not going to be able to focus on two things at once. And so I want to try a little experiment with you. So again, Stephanie, I'm going to rely on you to give me the answers after people have typed them into the chat box. But I'm going to put a story up on the next slide. And I want you to read that story while I read a different story. And then there's going to be a little quiz, and we're going to see how many you get right. You with me? Awesome. People have always searched for better and more efficient ways of doing things, whether it involved more effective ways of trapping animals for food or a more effective way of starting a fire with friction. But it wasn't until the late 1800s and early 1900s that anyone took a purposeful scientific approach to getting things done faster and with less effort. Frederick Winslow Taylor is normally considered to be the father of scientific management. He wrote his book, The Principles of Scientific Management, in 1911, together with the work of Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, became the launching pad for today's time management. It started as a quest to increase productivity in manufacturing, focused on the efficiency of individual workers, quickly spread to the office, and eventually encompassed the home environment as well. Taylor sought to be one best way to do every job, standardizing work methods and tools in order to increase productivity. Taylorism, as it is called, began to change the way organizations functioned. Before this time, organizations were set up in homes or informal businesses where workplaces were open. There were no barriers to communication, and ideas would flow freely among employees. Instead, manufacturing and office areas were separated, work became specialized, procedures became fixed and efficient. Unfortunately, communication decreased. Temporarily, at least, human relations took a back seat to productivity. This was not Taylor's intention. He was trying to make it easier for the employee as well as have them increase productivity, although he did not coin this phrase, work smarter, not harder. This was his intention. All right, you ready? Here's your quiz. How many trees did the woodcutter cut on his first day of the job? Who was the woodcutter working for? Who is considered the father of scientific management? What year did he write his book? And as a result of his work, what took a back seat to productivity? So just if you would, and we'll see how many people feel like they got 100%. Any results at this point, Stephanie?
Yes, varying numbers for number one. How many trees did the woodcutter cut on the first day of the job? We have
Uh-huh.
18, 18, 15, 10.
Yeah. 18 is the correct
18.
answer. Yep, 18 is the correct answer for the first day.
Mhm.
Okay. Who was the woodcutter working for?
No responses for that one.
Oh, okay. It was a timber merchant. So that was in the first set. Okay, interesting. Then how about question 3?
We have the
No?
various answers. Woodsman, timber owner.
Yeah, that was number 2.
Okay, so
Number
good.
3, who is considered the father of scientific management?
I have no idea.
Oh.
And
It was Frederick Taylor. He wrote his book in 1911, and human relations took a backseat to productivity. It was not his intention at all. So,
we didn't do so well.
I know. I trust me. When I did it. It was a little bit different story, reading and listening. But yeah, we're not going to get. We're going to get bits and pieces, right? We're not going to get the whole thing. So one of the challenges we have, and I think working remotely, it's really easy to be distracted and pretend we're listening. You know, we're on a Zoom call, and maybe people see us, or maybe they don't. Maybe we put our picture up there so nobody can see what I'm doing, and I'm on my mobile device, or I'm looking at something else on my phone or on my computer screen, or that kind of thing. I just want to tell you, multitasking does not serve anyone, especially you. And distractions are another piece to this whole idea, right? We talked about turning off your notifications, social media, news, email, games, apps, a steady diet of any of this stuff. As a matter of fact, new research is showing the more I switch back and forth between tasks, or the more I switch back and forth between email and news and apps, and so the more they call it learned ADD, right? The more I train my brain, and the harder it is for me to focus. Now, the good news is I can create new neural pathways. I can, by focus, that's why a tool like meditation or a tool like focused breathing can be really helpful to get me back on track. So let's quickly talk. I see we're getting I want to make sure we have time for questions. So one of the things I created was an acrostic for system. So start with a year. So think about the year. Like, where do you want to be May 12th, 2021? Now, I know it's uncertain, and I know we can't always predict the future, even in the best of circumstances, right? Even prior to March 15th or 23rd or whatever date in March you're choosing, it was difficult to predict a year in the future. But where do you want to be? Schedule that. Look at your day, evaluate where you are, and find a mechanism to measure. I don't know of any sports game that's played that doesn't have a way to keep score. So I want to encourage you to find a way, whatever mechanism that is, to keep score. So a year's planner, there's many out there. You might use digital, you might use something that's pen and pencil, paper and pencil, whatever. Find something that works for you, but think a big picture, right? And then break it down. If you are familiar with a concept in a book called Traction, Gino Wickman wrote about it. There's been other authors who've written similar ideas, but he talks about planning for the year, breaking it down into 90-day segments, quarterly segments, then the month, then the week, then the day. So everything I do rolls up to those activities. So schedule your day. Now, I'm a big believer and not only scheduling my day, but scheduling my week. So every Sunday evening, sometimes in the morning, but usually it's towards the end of the day, I think about what's my week going to look like, and what do I want to make sure I get accomplished, and what I'm going to make sure I put in my calendar, and then what am I going to avoid, right? Because I think that's just as important. Asking yourself a question about what stuff doesn't serve me, and then creating a plan for the day. So you might be familiar with Brandon Bouchard. He's on YouTube. He's got a book, and he talks about his morning routine. And one of the things he does in planning for his day is thinks through every meeting he's going to have, and sees himself showing up well intended, prepared for that meeting, and having that meeting have the best possible outcome. So something to consider. And then evaluating. Now, I think this is, again, a place where an accountability partner can help you make some changes. So maybe there's somebody on this call that's a colleague of yours, and you might say, you know what, there's one idea that I got from Leslie's talk today that I really want to implement, and I might be challenged to do that. Let's touch base certain day of the week for 15 minutes, and that touch base is by phone or Zoom or whatever method if you want, but it simply says, I did what I said I was going to do, or I didn't do it, and here's what I learned about that, and here's what I want to do moving forward. So I want to encourage you to find a way to evaluate and then measure. You might have heard this story. There was a young comic that asked Jerry Seinfeld how to get to be a good comedian. And Jerry said, you have to write for 15 minutes every day. And it doesn't matter what you write about, if you're writing good jokes or bad jokes, it doesn't matter. It's just the consistency of doing it. So he said to the young man, he said, you need to get a year's calendar. And then every day you write for 15 minutes, you put a big red X on that calendar. And you've seen them. They're big display calendars, and they can hang on your wall. And the goal then is not to break the chain. So maybe that would be a useful measurement to you, but I would encourage you to find some way, whatever method works for you, to measure activity, whether it's written in paper and pencil or digital. So now let me see, we've got, looks like about 7 minutes for questions, or maybe 5 if we get into too much trouble, but I'll ask that. I don't know if there was previous, or if people want to chat, put them in the chat box, or Stephanie, if you feel like you want to let people unmute themselves. Doesn't matter to me.
I just unmuted, so if anyone has any questions, any tips or tricks that you've learned that you'd like to share with the group, or
tips or tricks that you use that you want to share that I haven't talked about, because I always feel like we can learn from each other.
Oh, I do have a quick question.
Yes.
My willpower is pretty nil. I have none. And I always hear that it takes 21 days to form a habit. Is there any merit to that? If you can do something for 21 days, then it becomes pretty habitual.
It really takes 80 to 90. 21 days is a great start. I know people get discouraged, but here's what I would encourage you to think about is what mechanisms can you create? So I follow a guy on Darren Hardy. I mentioned him earlier with a journal. And he says, take willpower out of the equation. And he gives this personal example. He loves ice cream. And he said, if I have ice cream in the house, I will eat it. It does not cross my threshold. So that may work. I don't know what you're feeling you're not having willpower. I know for me, now that I'm working remotely and my kitchen is much more accessible, for whatever reason, I could leave the treats alone in the kitchen at work. But now this can be really challenging. So I've said that to my husband, don't bring it home. So I don't have to, at the end of the day, willpower is less. So I don't know if that helps Angelina or not. Anybody else? Stephanie, anything in the chat bar?
Nope. So any closing thoughts?
Yes. So the bad news is time flies. The good news is you're the pilot. So the more I know, the more we recognize that we are in control. We are the master of our destiny, the better served we are. It's simple, but not easy. And so one of the ideas on the resource page, if you look at the very bottom, there's a link to my calendar. And so if I can be of help to you, I offer a 30-minute, no obligation, no charge consultation. If there's something you'd like to talk about, just click that link and get on my schedule and we can make that happen. And if not, I totally appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with everyone this afternoon and share a few ideas, and connect with me on social media if you are so inclined, on LinkedIn if you want to reach out that way, and we can continue the conversation. So thanks, Stephanie, once again. I appreciate it. Oh, there's one.
I have one question from Ruth. How do I combat being tired all the time?
How do I combat being tired all the time? Well, I don't know. Making sure you're getting enough sleep, number one. If that, I mean, there are times where we do need to consult with a healthcare professional, but I think looking at our environment, I'm a big believer in drinking water to help stay alert, and using those kinds of things, making sure my nutrition is what it should be, because I think processed foods have a tendency to tire us out. Just really examining, and everybody has different circadian rhythms too. So looking at that, some people, my husband is a night owl. There is no doubt, always has been. I am not. So we have different schedules.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Leslie. Great information.
My pleasure, Stephanie.
Appreciate it. We've all got some homework to do. So have a great day. Enjoy spring, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Leslie. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thank you.